It's late. Whatever you should be doing, it can wait. You found the graveyard slot, stories for the hours nobody claims. It's just us now. Tonight's story, the 3 a.m. census. This one arrived typed, every line time-stamped to the second, sent from a hospital records office the building's own directory pretends isn't there. We read them as written. Let's begin. An hour and 48 minutes ago, my headset said my name. That shouldn't frighten anyone, except my headset is playback-only hardware, and the name it used exists on exactly one document in the world, and that document has never been inside this hospital. I want this on the record while it's still true. So let me put the rest on the record too, from the beginning. I transcribe dictation for a living. Doctors talk, I type, and somewhere in between I turn spoken word medicine into the kind of clean, liable document that can survive a courtroom. I've done it for 6 years, the last 6.5 months of them on graveyard, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. in a windowless records office in the sub-basement of St. Aldric's Regional that everyone with a day job pretends doesn't exist. I'm telling you this first because you need to understand that I am, by training and by punishment, a person who checks things twice. That's not a personality trait. It's a condition of my continued employment. Keep that in mind, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you. The punishment part, 8 months ago, I misheard a decimal point on a rush dictation from the ER 0.4 milligrams became 4. In my defense, the attending was talking around a sandwich, and it got as far as a nurse's hand before someone caught it. Nobody was hurt. I want to say that twice because it's true and because it didn't feel true for about 6 weeks afterward. I got a performance improvement plan instead of a termination, which the hospital's HR rep explained to me in the careful voice people use when they're not sure you won't cry in the meeting. 90 days of every transcript double-checked against the audio, every discrepancy logged, my supervisor copied on my own shame in real time. The 90 days turned into indefinite pending review the way these things do. I am still, as of tonight, on that plan. Here's the part that matters more than my pride. My son Dashiell is 7. He has a seizure disorder that was, for about a year, the kind of thing that ends marriages, and did. His father is 3 states away and current on child support the way weather is current on rain, which is to say sometimes. Dashiell's neurologist is 20 minutes from my apartment specifically because St. Aldric's insurance network includes her, and almost no other plan I could afford does. I am not a person with the luxury of quitting a job over a bad feeling. I am not even a person with the luxury of calling in sick without a doctor's note per my PIP terms, which explicitly bar unscheduled absence without documented cause as a terminable offense. I checked, twice. That's who I am at 11 p.m. on the night this happened. A woman who checks things twice because checking once already cost her almost everything. Sitting down at a keyboard in a basement because the alternative was worse. The job itself, if you've never done it, is duller than people think. Doctors dictate into a system after a patient encounter physical exam findings, assessment, plan, using a landline or a mobile app, and it lands in a queue sorted by unit. I work 4 West, which is general medicine plus overflow from wherever's backed up. I put on a headset, I open the audio file, I type what I hear into a template, and at the end of every note the physician states their name and provider ID out loud, a habit drilled into all of them because an unsigned dictation is a liability nightmare. After 6 years, I know the cadence of half the attending staff the way you know a song from the first 2 notes. Dr. Okafor talks fast and swallows his sibilants. Dr. Patterson pauses before every number like he's doing the math out loud. Provider IDs run 4 digits, and I have long since stopped needing to look most of them up. 2214 is Okafor, 3390 is Patterson, 1875 is the hospitalist group's rotating night guy, whoever that is this month. My own login works the same way. Every terminal in the sub-basement wants my badge number before to let me touch the queue. Debrel 440, typed so many thousands of times it doesn't feel like a number anymore, just the shape my hand makes before the night starts. I mention all this because at 11:40 p.m. I opened a file logged to 4 West, time-stamped for that shift, and it ended the way they all end, Vance closed provider, except the number that followed wasn't one I recognized, and worse, it wasn't 4 digits. It was 504413. I remember it specifically because provider IDs don't run 5 digits, ever. It's a fixed field in the intake system. And my first thought was not fear. My first thought was that I was going to have to log a system error, because logging system errors is what I do now. I log everything, and this was going to cost me 20 minutes I didn't have in a queue that was already backed up 11 files deep. I want you to sit with how boring that reaction was. That's the whole shape of this job. The horror when it came arrived wearing the costume of paperwork, and I checked its eye like I check everyone's, because that's the only self I have left at work. The dictation itself was routine enough. A patient encounter, generic vitals, an assessment of no acute distress. A plan to continue monitoring. Except that the room number given was 413, and I typed it automatically before some slower part of my brain caught up and said, 413 doesn't exist. St. Aldric's 4th floor got renumbered in 2019 after a fire suppression malfunction flooded and closed the east end of the old wing. I know this because half the senior transcriptionists still slip and use the old numbers, and correcting them was literally part of my onboarding packet. The old 401 through 415 became the new 401 through 414. Every room kept its own number except one. The room that used to be 413 wasn't renumbered into anything. It was gutted, rebuilt as a supply closet in a stretch of hallway, and nobody was ever going to be treated in it again. I know this cold. I corrected a night shift resident on it not 2 months ago, gently, the way you correct people when you're on a PIP and terrified of being seen is difficult. So a room that hasn't existed in 6 years had just generated a chart note with a 5-digit provider ID attached to it. I did what the good, punished version of me does now. I flagged it, wrote system/ID error, room number invalid, escalate to ITQ, and move to the next file, because the alternative was falling behind, and falling behind gets logged too. The next file was also 413, and it's the one I keep coming back to, because at the time it seemed like the most normal thing that happened to me all night. It opened like 100 geriatric medicine notes I've typed before. Social history, sleep-wake pattern, activities of daily living, the kind of section doctors dictate fast because insurers require it and nobody reads it twice. Patient reports an inverted sleep schedule, sleeps through daylight hours, alert and oriented overnight. Patient reports regular intake of caffeinated beverages, prefers a single-source convenience coffee, specifically the gas station on Route 9, purchased on the way to a fixed overnight location. I typed every word of that without registering a single one. Because you type what you hear, that's the job. You are not paid to editorialize on relevance. A patient with an inverted sleep schedule is not remarkable in a hospital. It's most of the building after 11 p.m. It was only much later, replaying it in my head at 4 in the morning with my hands gone cold on the keyboard, that I understood the coffee in question is the only coffee I drink, from the only gas station between here and my apartment, on the only route I take to get to a fixed overnight location. That location, when you say it in those words instead of the ones I use for it, is this desk. I have never once mentioned any of that to anyone inside this building. I don't put my commute in a chart. I don't put it anywhere. The one after that gave vitals the way vitals are always given. Heart rate, blood pressure, respirations, each one clipped in numeric, the most standardized 4 lines in the entire template. Heart rate 78, blood pressure 118/76, respirations 16. Then, instead of the line that always comes next, the clinical event or medication or intervention a vital sign gets measured against. So the number means something to whoever reads it later. This one gave me heart rate 78, recorded at time subject last checked door. Blood pressure 118/76, recorded at time subject's hand left the mouse. A third line did the same thing to respirations, tied to some other small motion I don't remember now, and wish I'd written down separately instead of folding it into my error log with the rest. I remember thinking, at 11:52 p.m., that whoever built this training dummy had gotten sloppy with the placeholder text, the way a bad form letter leaves the merge field showing "Dear, first name." So I fixed it in my head into something clinical sounding before I typed it, because that's a habit too, smoothing dictation into shape, correcting the recording the way I'd correct a resident, gently, so nobody downstream has to see the seams. It wasn't until the third time I saw that pattern, a number tied not to medicine but to emotion of mine, that I stopped smoothing and started copying it down exactly as spoken, error and all. Some part of me had started keeping evidence before the rest of me admitted there was a case to keep it for. The third one was worse in a way I didn't have words for until now. It was a discharge plan, tidy and complete, the kind of thing you'd read past without a second thought in any other context. Patient to be released into a lower observation setting. Recommend transfer off current unit at earliest availability. Continued monitoring not required once relocated. Case to be considered closed upon transfer. Read it as a patient file and it's the most boring paragraph in medicine. Read it as anything else. Read patient as employee and unit as shift and transfer as the thing that happens to people who ask too many questions on graveyard. And it stops being a discharge plan and starts being a memo about what happens to you once you've served your purpose somewhere. I didn't read it as anything else that night. I typed it as a discharge plan because that's what the template called it, and I filed it, and I want to be honest that the only reason I can tell you what it actually was is that I've had all night since to sit with it. At 12:35 the next 413 file came in, and this time I stopped and actually listened to the voice instead of just typing through it. The way you're taught to skim contracts until one clause makes you go back and read the whole page. It was a man, older, unhurried in a way none of the actual overnight staff ever are. Everyone dictating at midnight sounds like they're doing it between two other things, and this voice sounded like it had all the time there was. He introduced himself at the top of the note, which almost nobody does because the system already tags the file with a Dr. Ide before it ever reaches me. He said, attending Dr. Aldis Renner. I had never heard that name in 6 years in this building. I did the thing I always do now, which is check the schedule. St. Aldric's keeps a shared on-call board, accessible from the records terminal, showing which attendings are covering which unit for any given shift going back 2 years for auditing purposes. I searched Renner, nothing. Not that night, not any night, not on 4 West, not anywhere in the hospital. I searched the employee directory, nothing. I told myself out loud in an empty room that this was a training simulation file that had leaked into the active queue, which happens maybe twice a year. New hires get dummy dictations to practice on, sometimes with a placeholder doctor voice recorded by whoever drew the short straw in medical education. That was a real, boring, sufficient explanation, and it covered the coffee and the vitals and the discharge plan too if I wanted it to. Badly written filler dressed up with details some overeager instructional designer had pulled from somewhere, and I wrote it down as my working theory in my error log, because I document my theories now too, along with my mistakes. It was 12:52 a.m. I had 9 files left in queue, 3 of them 413, and I had lost 18 minutes to something that was, by any sane read, a clerical hiccup. At 1:15 I called Priya. Priya works the unit desk on 2 East most nights, and is the only person in this building I'd call at that hour without a documented reason, because we came up together and because she has, on 3 separate occasions, covered for me in ways that would get her in trouble if anyone asked. I wanted her to walk down to Health Information Management in the morning and ask someone with database access whether Renner showed up anywhere in the provider master file, active or archived. Her phone went to voicemail. I texted, no answer. I found out an hour ago when she finally called me back that her youngest had spiked a fever at 11 p.m. and she'd been up with him in urgent care 3 towns over, phone dead in her bag the whole time. There is no universe where I begrudge her that. But at 1:15 this morning all I had was the dial tone and the specific, growing awareness that the one person I could call without triggering my own PIP had gone dark at exactly the hour I needed her most. I thought about calling the nursing supervisor on call. My PIP handbook. I have read this document more times than I've read anything in my life. Permits contacting an on-call supervisor for life safety concerns only, with examples given: a fire, a code, a security threat. A weird voice on a dictation file is not on that list. And I knew with the specific clarity of someone who has already been disciplined once, that if I called and it turned out to be a training file, I would be the transcriptionist who panicked over nothing at 1 a.m. And that goes in a file too. I did not call. I want to be honest about that choice because it was mine, and because I haven't stopped turning it over since. I chose the queue over the phone call. I chose being right on paper over being safe. At 1:40, the next 413 file came in, and this one didn't have vitals in it at all. It opened the way they all open. Let the record reflect the time as 1:40 a.m., which is standard boilerplate. Dictating doctors are trained to timestamp their own notes verbally in case the system clock and the real clock disagree. I've typed that exact phrase 10,000 times and never once thought about it as anything other than furniture. But the note that followed wasn't a physical exam. It was a description of a woman at a desk, alone, in a room with no windows, transcribing. It used the word subject. It said the subject had been made aware, twice now, that something was irregular and had elected, on both occasions, to document the irregularity rather than to act on it, and that this response pattern was consistent with prior encounters and expected, given subject's employment history. It closed the way they all closed. Vance, close, provider 04413. I sat there with my hand on the mouse and did not move it for what the file's own counter tells me was around 90 seconds because I checked afterward, because I check everything. I typed the number into my log the way I type every number, mechanically, digit by digit 04413, and some tired pattern-matching part of my brain that wasn't even trying flagged it as familiar, and then let it go, the way you almost place a song, and then the moment passes. I didn't chase it. I had 4 files left in a queue that doesn't care what's chasing you. At 2:10, still telling myself this was explainable, I did something I'm not supposed to do and have already reported myself for, which tells you something about who I am even now. I use my supervisor's still logged in remote session. She does support calls from home some nights and forgets to close the connection, a security hole I'd flagged twice in writing, for what it's worth, to pull the closed personnel file on Aldis Renner. It existed. Attending physician, internal medicine, credentialed at St. Aldric's from 1994 until his file's termination date, which was the same week in 2019 as the fire suppression incident on the old 4th floor. There was no cause of separation listed, just a field that read status, closed, do not reassign queue, which is not standard HR language. That's a systems note. The kind IT leaves on an account they're afraid to fully delete because something's still pointing at it. His last recorded assignment, the file said, was 4 West. His last documented patient encounter, the file said, was in room 413. I want to tell you I put it together right then. I didn't. I wrote possible identity theft of decommissioned provider account, escalate to IT and compliance, urgent, in my log, and then, because the session was still open, and because I had already crossed the line where a second offense costs meaningfully more than a first. So I might as well know what I was going to be written up for. I did it again. I searched the incident management system, the one HIM uses for facilities events, not patient care, for whatever had actually happened on the old 4th floor in 2019. I've never had a reason to look at that database before tonight, and I doubt I'll be allowed near it again. The report was there, filed under facilities, safety, incident number and all, and it had clearly been through more than one round of legal review before anyone let it rest, because entire lines were blacked out in a way that made the remaining words read like a ransom note assembled from a form. The summary field, the part every incident report opens with, one sentence a risk manager can read without scrolling, said, "Fire suppression activation, 4th floor east, no fire condition present." 'Cause under review. See attached. Nothing was attached. Or if it had been, it wasn't in the version that still lived where a supervisor's forgotten logging could find it. What survived in the body of the report told me the system had activated with no smoke condition logged on any detector on the floor, no heat rise event, no alarm pull anywhere in the wing. It had activated in one room only. The report specified twice, in 2 different sections, as if the writer wanted to be sure whoever read it later understood that this was the part that mattered. Not the whole zone, the way the system is designed and tested to trigger, but a single sprinkler head over a single room. At 3:04 a.m., I sat with that time longer than I should have, because it is not my time. It belongs to a night 6 years before I ever badged into this building. It is also 11 minutes off the clock position the security phone would ring dead at tonight. I checked twice and could not make the difference mean anything. And the same hour this floor seems to come alive in general. As if 3 a.m. isn't a time here so much as a door that opens partway on a hinge and doesn't quite close again before it's due to open next. The investigator's summary, in the dry voice of someone who has been told to write around a thing rather than about it, noted that the resulting water damage pattern was inconsistent with suppression discharge. I have read that sentence 11 times now. It means, as far as I can tell, that whatever put water on that floor did not behave the way water falling from a sprinkler head behaves. Not the spread, not the pooling. And one clipped line further down, added almost as an afterthought, noted no pressure drop in the supply line. A sprinkler head had gone off, apparently, without emptying the pipe that feeds it. I don't know what that means either. I know what it doesn't mean, which is water. There was a witness list at the back, 4 names. The kind of list HIM keeps because insurance requires a record of who was on the floor when something goes into a claim file. 3 names were printed in full, 2 nurses I didn't recognize, long since transferred or gone, and a maintenance engineer whose name I did recognize because he retired the year I started and still shows up in old equipment logs. The 4th had been redacted down to a single capital letter, first initial only, the rest of the name blacked out so completely and so evenly that I could see the pressure marks of the marker through the scan, a hand pressing hard enough to matter on a document nobody was ever supposed to look at twice. I don't know why that redacted initial unsettled me more than the room number or the timestamp or the sentence about the pipe, but it did, and it still does, and I want to be honest that I have a guess about what letter would make sense there, and I am not going to write it down, because writing it down is the thing that seems to make things true in this building tonight. And I am done handing it material. I did not have a working theory for any of this, not one I could put in a log and defend to a supervisor in the morning. I wrote down what I'd found anyway, because writing it down is the only tool I have ever been given for a feeling that big, and then I closed the session and went back to the queue because it was 2:20 in the morning and I had 4 files left and a shift that did not end until 7, and somewhere in me, even then, the machine that keeps me employed was still running. At 2:53, the queue counter, which had been climbing slowly all night the way it always does on a slow ward, jumped from 6 waiting files to 19 in the space of about 4 minutes. I have screenshots. I don't fully understand what I was looking at, but 19 dictations do not get recorded in 4 minutes by anyone, human or otherwise. Dictation takes as long as talking takes. I opened the newest one anyway, because the alternative, letting the backlog sit unflagged overnight, was its own kind of violation I get written up for, and even in the middle of this I could not make myself stop being the employee who gets written up for things. It was 4:13 again. Let the record reflect the time is 2:53 a.m., correct to the minute, matching my monitor clock exactly, which the earlier files hadn't quite done. They'd run a minute or 2 behind real time like normal recordings do. This one was real-time accurate. It described the subject, me, as having, quote, elected escalation through informal channels, which could only mean Priya, whom I had called on my personal cell, not any hospital line, a call this system had no earthly business knowing about. It said the subject continued to exhibit the documented behavioral pattern, awareness without action, correct identification of irregularity without corresponding intervention, a 6-year record, it said, of a mind trained specifically to notice and specifically not to stop. One of the 19, a little further down the list, wasn't about that night at all. It opened with the same boilerplate as everything else. Let the record reflect the time is 9:41 p.m., and then it named a date, and I did the arithmetic without wanting to and got 8 months back, and I understood within the next sentence that it was describing my decimal point, not the disciplinary version. I have that version memorized the way you memorize a scar. A single clean paragraph in my personnel file about a documented medication transcription discrepancy, self-identified and corrected within the same shift. Language chosen by someone in HR to be survivable if I ever had to read it out loud in an appeal. This version had none of that mercy in it, and it had texture the real record doesn't have, and was never built to have, because the real record is written by people who weren't in the room. It said the subject, upon recognizing the error, upon hearing her own fingers have already typed a 4 where a decimal point belonged, sat completely still for 6 seconds, then said aloud to an empty room, "No, no, no, that's not," and stopped herself mid-word. I have never told anyone that I said that. There was no one in the room to hear it. I have never repeated it since, not to HR, not to the union rep who sat in on my disciplinary hearing with a legal pad and a face arranged into practice sympathy, not to Priya, not to my own reflection rehearsing the apology I never got to give the nurse who almost administered it. It said the subject rose from her chair 30 seconds later and crossed to the records room door, which locks automatically on a 10-second delay, and which she had already locked, out of habit, 20 minutes earlier, and checked it. Not once. It said she checked it at 9:47, found it locked, sat back down, and then got back up and checked it again at 9:52, before finally returning to her terminal to place the correction call that saved a stranger's life and ended, in every way that matters, the version of my career I thought I was going to have. Nobody wrote any of that down. There was no camera in that room 8 months ago. There still isn't one. I have checked. I was alone the way I am alone in this one tonight, and something had apparently been keeping time anyway, close enough to count the seconds between when I stood up and when I sat back down. I sat with that file open longer than I sat with any of the others, because the thing underneath it, the thing I have not stopped turning over since, is that this wasn't written like a memory of my mistake. It was written like a note taken during it, present tense in the places where every other file tonight had been reflective, describing me the way a person describes weather they're standing in, not weather they remember. Which means if I let myself follow it all the way to where it goes, that whatever has been dictating into this queue all night did not start paying attention to me 8 months from tonight, on the strength of one clerical accident that happened to catch its interest afterward. It was already in the room. It was already watching, already timing my hand on a door handle on the exact evening a bad decimal point put me on a PIP and moved me 6 weeks later, by a scheduling decision I was told at the time was the only graveyard opening that fit my restrictions, off-day shift and onto this one, into an empty sub-basement office with a phone that only rings from inside the building. I have spent 6 years assuming the worst thing I ever did to myself was mine alone, a private failure nobody witnessed. I am no longer sure the error was the beginning of anything. I am not sure it wasn't the selection, and I am not sure if it was that the transfer that followed it was as much the only opening that fit as I was told. That's when the security phone on the wall started ringing. I need you to understand what that phone is before I tell you what it isn't. It's an internal extension, not my desk line, wired directly into the building's own switch. It cannot dial out and it cannot ring in from outside. No cell towers involved, no outside carrier, nothing that could be spoofed or misrouted by a stranger with a laptop 3 states away. In the 6.5 months I've been down here, it has rung exactly 4 times, 3 times the guard station confirming a round, once the nursing supervisor asking why my lights were still on during a power flicker. Whatever was calling it at 2:53 in the morning was, by the plain hard fact of the wiring, calling from somewhere inside St. Aldric's. Not from outside, from in here with me. Round should have put a guard past my hallway at 2 a.m. and again at 4. Nobody had come by at 2. I'd noted it, the way I note everything now, a little tick mark in my log. 2 o'clock round, not observed. I told myself he was running behind or on a call or dealing with the ER, which floods sometimes, which is a real and ordinary thing that happens. At 3:10 I called the guard station myself to ask, and got the same dead ring out I'd gotten from Priya, on a line that has never once, in 6 years, failed to connect. I did not answer the security phone at 2:53. I sat and watched it ring 9 times and stop, And I have never in my life wanted so badly for a phone to keep ringing, because a phone that stops ringing means someone somewhere decided that was enough tries, and I did not want to know what came after enough tries. My urgent emails to supervisors in IT vanished the same way. I emailed my supervisor, compliance, and the IT help desk simultaneously, time-stamped, subject line urgent, laying out the ID discrepancy, the closed personnel file, the incident report, the room number, all of it, in the flat procedural language I've been trained to use so nobody can accuse me of overreacting. In the corner of the screen, in the queue count, I have not stopped tracking all night. The number ticked up by exactly 1 in the same second my cursor landed on send. I did not click anything else. I did not receive an autoreply, which every other 3 a.m. email I have ever sent this building has generated within 90 seconds. I checked the outbox. Sent, time-stamped, no bounce. Just gone into a building that, for one email, apparently had nobody home to receive it. At 3:22, before I let myself go anywhere near a stairwell, I did the one thing my PIP handbook has never once tried to stop me from doing. Because even St. Aldric's isn't willing to write a policy against a mother checking on her kid. I called my downstairs neighbor Odette, who sits with the Gilles some nights for $20 and the run of my Netflix password, to ask, in a voice I worked hard to keep boring, whether he'd slept through. He had. He was fine, snoring sideways across the bed the way he does when his medication's timed right, Odette said, and I could hear my own television running low in the background of her end of the call. Canned laughter from some rerun. The most ordinary sound I'd heard all night, and I held on to it the way you hold a railing. I did not tell her why I was asking. I have gotten very good, in 6 years of this job, at asking the question underneath the question without ever saying the real one out loud. I hung up and put my phone face down on the desk, the way I do every night once I know he's breathing, a small closing ritual that has nothing to do with St. Aldric's and never has. The next file in queue, when I made myself open it because the alternative was watching the backlog grow, was 413, and it did not mention Dashiell by name. I want to be exact about that because exactness is the only defense I have left tonight. It did not need to. It opened on the boilerplate. Let the record reflect the time as 3:23 a.m., 1 minute after I'd hung up, and then gave a plan of care that read, on its face, like nothing. Continue current supervision arrangement. No change in caregiver recommended. Reassess only if subject schedule changes. I read that clause 4 times before I understood what it was doing, which was telling me, in the flattest possible language, that whatever kept the ledger on this floor had already priced in who else was in my apartment tonight, and had filed it under a category with the word arrangement in it, and considered the matter closed unless something about my schedule gave it a reason to reopen. I did not call Odette back. There was nothing to tell her that wouldn't have sounded, said out loud at 3:30 in the morning, exactly like the kind of thing that gets a mother, a very different sort of file opened on her, at a very different sort of desk. At 3:40, I walked out of the records office and down the sub-basement hall to the service stairwell, because I needed physically to be somewhere that wasn't that chair, and because some small intact part of me still believed that if I could just get eyes on an actual nurse, an actual guard, anyone with a pulse and a badge, this would collapse back into the shape of a bad prank or a software bug. The stairwell door to the ground floor was propped, which it never is after hours, fire code, and propped with a rolled-up supply requisition form for Unit 4 West, the kind we haven't used since before the 2019 renovation, printed with the old room numbering. 413 was on that list. Someone, at some point recently enough that the paper hadn't yellowed, had gone to the trouble of finding an obsolete form and using it to hold a door. I did not go up that first time. I stood on the sub-basement landing for maybe 30 seconds, looking at a piece of paper with a room number on it that hadn't existed in 6 years, and I almost turned around right there. But the stairwell was quiet in a way that felt, for just that stretch of 30 seconds, like ordinary quiet. A building at 3:40 in the morning, nothing more. And something in me needed that badly enough to keep climbing. I went up one flight, past the prop door to the ground floor landing, close enough to see the lobby through the wire glass panel set into the stairwell door. The lobby was lit the way it always is overnight, that low amber setting the facilities team uses to save on the electric bill. And it was empty in a way that took me a moment to place, because emptiness alone wouldn't have been strange at that hour. Plenty of nights I've come up for air and found the lobby with nobody visibly in it. The receptionist in the back office, a security guard doing a slow lap, a respiratory therapist cutting through on the way to the parking structure. It was the silence underneath the emptiness that stopped me, not the emptiness itself. St. Aldric's has a night receptionist at that desk 24 hours a day without exception. It's in the same policy binder as everything else I've quoted tonight. Front desk coverage is a life safety requirement, not a convenience. I have seen the coverage schedule myself because payroll routes through the same terminal I use, and there was no one at it, which on its own I could have explained a dozen ways. A bathroom break, a delivery at the loading dock, a call taken standing up somewhere out of sight. What I couldn't explain, and stood there long enough to be sure I wasn't imagining, was that I could hear none of the ordinary sounds a lobby makes, even when nobody's sitting in it. No hum from the vending machines against the far wall, which run warm enough at night that you can usually hear the compressor cycle from the stairwell door. No tick of the wall clock above the reception desk, an actual mechanical clock, the kind with a second hand that you'd think, of all things, would survive whatever this was. No HVAC breath moving the leaves of the potted plant by the sliding doors, which move even when the building is otherwise as quiet as it gets, because a hospital's air handlers never fully stop. Nothing. It was not the silence of a room with no one in it. It was the silence of a recording with the levels turned all the way down, queued up and waiting for someone to press play on it. The exact texture of dead air I have heard at the front of every one of my own files before the doctor starts talking. I stood at that glass panel longer than I want to admit, watching a lobby that should have had a heartbeat somewhere in it and didn't, and then I went back down, past the prop door in its obsolete form, back to my desk, because the queue was at 22 files and climbing, and some catastrophic, well-trained part of my brain had decided that the safest available action was to keep typing. Back at my desk, the queue had grown by one file in the time I'd been gone, which should not have been possible, because dictation requires the doctor speaking into a phone or an app, and no call had come through my monitor's own log in that window. I checked the log before I checked anything else. The new file was 413. It opened the way the others had, let the record reflect the time as 3:51 a.m., which was near enough that I timed it against my own phone afterward, the minute I'd been standing at the wire glass door looking into the lobby. The body of the note documented a gap in observation, quote, subject away from primary workstation, duration approximately 11 minutes, no incident to report upon return. I sat with the word upon, longer than a word that small should get to keep anyone's attention, because it meant the sentence had been written to be true before I'd finished climbing back down the stairs to make it true. I had told no one I was leaving. There was no camera on that stretch of hallway. I'd checked that months earlier for an unrelated, embarrassingly small reason involving a missing stapler, and confirmed there wasn't. Something had clocked me out and back in on a system that isn't supposed to know the difference between a woman at her desk and a woman who isn't, as casually as I log a bathroom break, and had used, of all the words available to it, the word primary, as though it already had a use in mind for me that this workstation was only the first version of. The 4 a.m. round didn't come either. I know because I was watching the clock for it by then, the way you watch a pot you've already decided isn't going to boil, just to have something to be right about. Rounds run on a 15-minute grace window, so I gave it until 4:12 before I let myself believe it wasn't coming, and I spent that window standing instead of sitting, which I never do, because sitting felt for the first time all night like a decision instead of a default. At 3:58, I got up and stood by my own door with it open a crack, telling myself I'd hear him coming down the hall the way I always do. That specific, unhurried gate security guards get after enough years of walking the same route. Keys ticking against a belt loop, the little scuff of a flashlight beam checked and clicked off out of habit at doors that don't need checking. At 4:03 I heard footsteps. One set, unhurried, exactly the pace of a round. Not fast, not the pace of someone startled or hurrying to answer a page. The specific metered pace of a person who has walked this same length of hallway hundreds of times and long ago stopped needing to think about where his feet go. Close enough, when they passed my door, that I held still and almost said something through the gap. Some ordinary sentence like, "Hey, you're late, everything okay out there?" The kind of thing you say to a person you're relieved to hear. They passed. I did not open the door further because for one held breath, the part of me that has been checking things twice all night checked this too. And it told me to wait until they'd gone by before I said anything at all. Which is the only reason I'm alive to tell you I didn't say it. It was only after they'd gone by that I placed what was wrong with them. They were headed away from the stairwell, away from the exit that leads back up toward the guard station and the rest of the round's route, toward the dead end at the far side of the sub-basement where the hallway just stops in a poured concrete wall that used to, before 2019, connect to the old East Wing. I have walked that dead end myself, on slow nights out of nothing but restlessness. There is a fire extinguisher, a junction box, and 11 feet of hallway that goes nowhere. Nobody walks around in that direction because there's nothing down there to check, and a guard who's worked this roof for any length of time would no more walk toward it than you'd walk toward a wall in your own hallway at home. The footsteps did not slow down or turn back. They simply went on, at round's pace, toward a wall, until I couldn't hear them anymore, and I never heard them come back the other way. I told myself it was maintenance first, before I let myself do anything else, because maintenance is a real category of person who has real reasons to walk toward junction boxes at 4 in the morning. And then, because I don't believe things anymore just because I've told myself them, I pulled the badge swipe log for the sub-basement access door, the one door between this hallway and the stairwell, the only door a guard, a maintenance worker, or anyone else would have to swipe through to reach me at all, since the sub-basement has no other way and that isn't, itself, alarmed. There was no entry at 403, not a swipe, not a denied attempt, not a prop door alarm. Not even the door held open event. The system logs automatically when someone jams it with a cart for more than 30 seconds. I widened the window, told myself I might have misjudged the time by a minute either way, and pulled every event on that door for the hour on either side of 403. Nothing at all on either side of that timestamp for 11 straight minutes. Not one recorded event, which is itself strange on a night shift, because that door gets used by somebody every 20 minutes or so, even on the quietest nights, cleaning staff, the odd nurse taking a shortcut. For 11 minutes, according to the only system built to know, nobody had come through that door in either direction. Whoever had walked past my door at round's pace, headed toward a dead end, had not used the only door that exists to get there, and had not, as far as the building's own memory is concerned, entered this hallway at all. At 4:31, I got as far as standing with my coat half over one arm, keys already in hand, having decided in the specific and total way you decide things, at 4 in the morning after 5.5 hours of this, that no PIP and no insurance network was worth whatever building I was currently standing inside of, that I would drive home, wake de Gilles if I had to, and figure out the rest of my life from a kitchen table that wasn't underground. I got exactly as far as the doorway. Then I thought, with the clarity of someone who has spent 8 months training herself out of acting on feeling alone, about what an unexplained abandoned shift does to a PIP that already has my name flagged for review, about the specific line in my handbook that lists walk-off as grounds for immediate termination without the 30-day appeal window every other violation gets, about de Gilles' neurologist and the specific insurance code that pays for the specific medication that keeps him from seizing in his sleep, and I took to Ketbach, and I sat back. That's its own kind of horror, and I had lived inside it for 8 months before tonight ever bothered adding a second one on top. At 4:50, working through the backlog on autopilot, typing my own badge number into yet another login prompt without looking at it, my hand stalled over the keys, because my hand had finally noticed what the rest of me had been refusing to. 31440. Read it back to front. 04413. It isn't a different number wearing a disguise. It's mine reversed, worn like a mask with the eye holes in the wrong place. Whatever had been dictating into that queue all night, closing every note, signing every impossible room, describing a woman at a desk who noticed things and didn't act on them, had built its own name entirely out of the one piece of identification St. Aldric's requires me to type before it will let me work at all. The queue was at 31 files when the headset activated. I need you to understand what that means because it's the only part of this I can prove with hardware and not just my own testimony. My headset connects to a playback deck. It has one function. It plays pre-recorded audio files that already exist in the queue, files I select and open myself. It has no microphone function on this end, no real-time patch capability, nothing. I've used the same 3 headsets on rotation for 2 years, and none of them have ever, not once, produced sound I did not select. At 5:04 a.m., with no file open on my screen, with the cursor sitting idle over an unopened line in the queue, I heard breathing in my left ear. Slow, unhurried. The kind of unhurried that had been running underneath every Let the Record Reflect all night. Then it said my name. Not Vance. Not the subject, Marisol. Nobody at St. Aldric's calls me that. It's not on my badge, my email signature, my time clock login, or any document this hospital has ever generated about me. It's the name on my son's emergency contact card, the one I fill out fresh every year for a school, the one document in this entire city where I'm not an employee number first. I have never once said that name out loud in this building. I checked after whether it appears anywhere in St. Aldric's system at all. It doesn't. There is no clerical explanation for how a dictation queue learned it. And then it said, "Let the record reflect, the time is 5:04 a.m. State your full name and provider identification for the file, Marisol, so I can close this properly." The subject has always preferred things closed properly. It's in her file. There is a line in the queue that opened at that exact second, unrequested, nobody's cursor on it, waiting the way every dictation waits for somebody to press play and put a voice into a shape that will outlast the person who made it. Every file I have transcribed for 6 years exists because somebody spoke and I decided their words were worth keeping. That's the whole of what this job is. That's the only power I've ever had in this building, on this shift, in this life. Deciding what gets kept. The headset was still on. I could hear him breathing, patient, on the other end of a connection that was not supposed to exist, waiting for me to do the one thing I am better trained to do than anyone else in this hospital. Open my mouth, say my name clearly enough for the record, and make it true. Instead, I did the other thing I'm trained to do. The only other thing. I pressed play on the unopened line and I transcribed him. The breathing, the pauses, the exact unhurried wrongness of that voice. I put all of it into the template, time-stamped to the second, the way I've spent 6 years putting voices into shapes that outlast the people who made them. He talked, and I typed, and somewhere in the last of it, he must have understood what I was doing, because the voice sped up. The first time all night, it sounded like every other doctor at 3 a.m., like something running out of time between 2 other things. And where the signature goes, where he'd spent 5 hours and change wearing my number backward, I typed it forward. 31440. Vance. Close. The breathing cut off mid-inhale. The queue went to 0, all 31 files, gone, like a held breath finally let out of the building. I'm typing this at 6:52 from the same chair because I document everything, and I want it on the record while it's still true. I beat it. I closed him properly. I decided what got kept. But the day shift queue seeds itself at 6:45 every morning, automatic, and it seeded exactly 1 file today. Room 413, provider 31440. My number, forward, 40. My number. I haven't pressed play. I don't need to. I already know whose voice is on it. And that's where she leaves it. The Graveyard Slot airs twice a week. New stories in the dead hours, wherever you're hearing this. If tonight kept you company, follow the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube. It matters more than it should. And if something ever happened to you, Something you've been carrying, something nobody believed. Write it down and send it in. The address is thegraveyardslot.com. We read them as written. Until next time then, keep your porch light on, not because it helps, because it's polite to whatever's watching. This has been the Graveyard Slot. We're off the air.